She didn't even try to hide it. 1 second, I was reaching for the folder on the conference table. The next, her perfectly manicured hand slammed against my shoulder, shoving me backward hard enough to make my ID badge swing. "Don't touch what isn't yours," she hissed, loud enough for everyone to hear. A wave of silence swept across the boardroom. My fingers trembled, but I didn't let them see it. I steadied myself, blinked away the sting behind my eyes, and pretended I hadn't just been humiliated in front of half the executive team. Her ring sparkled like a warning, flawless, just like the engagement photos she'd posted hours before this meeting. She was the CEO's fiancée, beautiful, vicious, and clearly determined to remind everyone that no one else had the right to stand beside him, especially not someone like me. I should have walked away. I should have ignored it, like I always did. But this time, something inside me cracked. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just looked at her, long enough for the tension to thicken like glass. And then his voice sliced through the silence, deeper than I'd ever heard it before. "Touch her again," he said slowly, stepping through the doorway without breaking eye contact, "and this wedding is off." Gasps followed. She turned pale. I didn't move, not even when his eyes met mine and softened like he'd just realized he should have said those words years ago. The air shifted, like the entire room was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. But for the first time since I met her, she had nothing to say. Her lips parted, then closed. Her heels clicked once as she stepped back, not from me, but from him. "You're defending her," she finally spat, voice thin with disbelief. In front of everyone. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were still locked on mine, as if I was the only person who existed in that room. I saw something flicker behind his expression. Regret, maybe. Or realization. I had spent months working under his shadow, learning his habits, avoiding his gaze because I thought distance was safer. And now, with just one sentence, he'd shattered every unspoken boundary between us. "You can't be serious," she whispered, voice cracking. But he was. You could see it in the way he stepped between us, not dramatic, not loud, just certain, like he'd already made up his mind long before today. I felt eyes on me, from the interns, the managers, the advisors lining the back wall. But no one said a word. It was like we were suspended in a scene that didn't belong in real life. But I was standing in it, blinking, trying to understand how everything had changed in under 60 seconds. She looked at me like I'd just stolen her life, but I hadn't done anything. And that was the part that scared me most. He walked toward me slowly, each step louder than the last. I didn't breathe. My instinct screamed at me to look away, to retreat into the familiar shell I'd spent years building, the one that kept me invisible, safe, irrelevant. But something about the way he looked at me didn't feel like pity. It felt like memory, like he was seeing a version of me he used to know. "Are you okay?" he asked, voice low, steady, like it wasn't just a question about the shove, but about everything I'd been carrying in silence. I nodded, but my throat burned. My voice betrayed me and stayed locked behind my ribs. She scoffed behind him, her voice rising, desperate now. "This is ridiculous. She's just enough," he cut in without even turning. And that was it. The woman who had walked into this meeting arm in arm with the most powerful man in the building now stood trembling, stunned by a silence that she no longer controlled. I had imagined so many humiliations in this job, so many exits, so many broken moments, but never once had I pictured him standing between me and everything I was taught to endure. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't offer a grand gesture. He just stood there beside me, as if that alone could change the way people saw me and the way I was starting to see myself. That's when I knew something had shifted, not just in the room, but in him, and maybe in me too. The meeting ended, but no one really moved. Papers stayed untouched. Laptops remained closed, as if everyone was afraid that blinking would make them miss the next twist. But he didn't say another word. He just turned to me, gave the smallest nod, and walked out of the room like the explosion he'd triggered wasn't still ringing in everyone's ears. I stood there frozen, the imprint of his words burning in the silence he left behind. When I finally stepped into the hallway, the whispers began, hushed, fast, slicing through the quiet like needles. I walked past them anyway. I'd learned how to walk through walls of judgment a long time ago. But this time, something felt different. Not because they had stopped underestimating me, but because he hadn't. I reached the elevator and pressed the button with hands that still trembled. And when the doors opened, he was standing inside, alone, like he was waiting. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed not to get in. But I stepped forward anyway, and the doors closed behind me like a secret sealing itself. We didn't speak. He didn't look at me right away. But then, just before the elevator reached his floor, he asked, "Has she done that to you before?" His voice was quieter now, softer, but it held something new, anger, not loud or violent, controlled, focused. It wasn't about the shove anymore. It was about the story behind it, the one I never told. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe he was ready to hear it. I didn't answer right away. The elevator kept climbing, floor by floor, and the silence between us thickened. He didn't pressure me, just waited, like someone who already knew the answer but wanted me to say it out loud on my terms. "She's never touched me before," I finally said, but words she throws those like knives. He looked down, jaw tightening slightly. I noticed. His voice was flat, but there was heat behind it, a fire he was holding back for my sake. I hadn't expected that. Most people pretend not to notice things like that, especially men like him. Especially when the one throwing the knives is wearing a diamond worth 3 car payments. "You could have said something sooner," he added. Not accusing, not cold, just puzzled. I shook my head. And risk making things worse? I've seen how these stories go. The quiet girl always ends up being the problem. He didn't deny it. He just watched me, the way someone watches a storm they walked through without ever realizing how hard it hit someone else. The elevator slowed. He looked forward again, but before the doors opened, he said something that lingered. "That won't happen again. Not while I'm here." And then he stepped out. No dramatic glance back. No speech. Just those words, simple, clean, final. I stayed inside the elevator, frozen between relief and confusion, because something about the way he said it didn't sound like an apology. It sounded like a promise. I rode the elevator back down alone. My reflection stared back at me from the mirrored panel. The smudged eyeliner, the hair I'd tied up too hastily, the quiet woman everyone overlooked until today. But even now, I didn't feel powerful. I felt exposed. His words still rang in my ears. "Not while I'm here." What did that even mean? Was it just heat of the moment kindness? Guilt? Or something else? I didn't know how to hold it. It had been years since anyone had stepped between me and cruelty. Years since anyone had said I mattered. Not as a colleague, not as a tool, but as a human being. I found myself back in the restroom where it had all started. The echo of that slap still lived in the walls. I washed my hands even though they weren't dirty. The water was warm, calming, but my chest was tight. Too many feelings, too fast. Part of me wanted to pretend none of it had happened. Just erase the moment, erase him. But when I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the same version of myself anymore. There was a question in my eyes, one I hadn't dared to ask in years. What if someone actually sees me? Not for what I do, not for what I hide, but for who I am underneath all the silence. I dried my hands slowly. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a small photo, one I always kept hidden. It was time someone else saw it too. The soft stillness between us shattered like glass when her heels echoed down the hallway. His fiancée, perfect posture, flawless skin, eyes sharp like ice. She didn't stop walking. She marched straight to him and looped her arm around his. "You've been gone for 20 minutes, she said sweetly, though her smile didn't touch her eyes. Then her gaze slid to me, assessing, dissecting. Didn't realize the intern required personal attention. I opened my mouth to correct her. I wasn't an intern, I hadn't been for months, but I stopped. What would it change? Her eyes were already set on me, like I didn't belong in the picture. He gently removed her hand from his arm, his jaw tightening. We were talking. Clearly, she said, letting out a brittle laugh. You know, some people might get the wrong idea. You, hiding in a hallway with someone like, stop, he said, his voice low, but it cut clean. It was the kind of tone that didn't need to be loud to be heard. She blinked, startled. I stood frozen, the newspaper still in my hand, heart pounding. She took a step closer, and without warning, bumped her shoulder into mine as if passing accidentally. It was subtle but deliberate, and enough. I didn't react. I couldn't. Not until he turned fully to her, voice steel. Touch her again, he said, and this wedding is off. The hallway dropped into silence. My ears rang. Her face paled, the venom evaporating from her posture. For the first time, I wasn't the one being dismissed. I stood there, unmoving, as if my body had forgotten how to breathe. The silence, left in his words, echoed louder than the tension itself. I could feel every pair of eyes from the corridor behind us. Assistants, board members, someone holding a clipboard who suddenly forgot why they were even there. But none of that mattered. Not when someone had actually spoken for me. Not about me. I glanced at his fiancée, who was now rooted in place, her composure cracked, but still clinging to it like a glass barely holding under pressure. She looked between us, a flicker of disbelief twisting across her perfect features, not because of what he'd said, but because he had meant it. I didn't know whether to apologize or thank him. My instinct was to shrink, to escape the attention, to pretend none of this had happened. But I didn't move. Not this time. I simply lowered my eyes, folded the newspaper clipping slowly, and handed it back to him with both hands, like it was something sacred. He didn't take it. Keep it, he said. If she's going to talk about you, at least let her know who she's actually dealing with. My fingers curled around the paper, but my voice didn't come. It was stuck in the place where years of being overlooked and spoken over had lived. For once, I had no defense ready because none was needed. I wasn't invisible anymore. And maybe, for the first time, I didn't have to be small to feel safe. He didn't raise his voice again. He didn't have to. His silence, the kind that carried meaning without force, settled over us like a verdict. The fiancée didn't speak either. She straightened her dress, adjusted the strap on her handbag, and walked away like nothing had happened, except that her heels trembled slightly on the marble floor. As she disappeared around the corner, he turned back to me, but not immediately. There was a pause, deliberate, as if he wanted to make sure I understood. You weren't the one who should feel ashamed. You don't deserve to be pushed, he said simply. Not here. Not by anyone. It wasn't grand or poetic. It didn't need to be. It was the way he looked at me that carried the weight, like I was someone who mattered. I felt my throat tighten, words forming but refusing to be spoken. I wasn't used to this version of reality, one where someone defended me before I could defend myself, one where I didn't have to prove I was worth basic respect. She doesn't like me, I finally whispered. He nodded. She doesn't know you. Then, softer, but I'd like to. I looked up, startled. His gaze didn't waver. There was no flirtation, no performance, just sincerity. And it scared me more than anything, because it wasn't the kind of line someone said to be kind. It was the kind that made you wonder what this moment would mean tomorrow. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to wonder. The photo was worn from years of hiding. Corners frayed, the colors faded just enough to feel like a memory instead of a moment. In it, I stood in front of a small bookstore, maybe 15, wearing a blue floral hanbok and the biggest smile I'd ever owned. My mother had taken that photo the day before she passed. It was the last time someone had told me I looked beautiful without asking me to change. I stared at it now, my thumb brushing the crease down the middle. For years, I carried it like armor. Not because it made me strong, but because it reminded me I had once been seen. Truly seen. I slipped it back into my bag, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite name. I didn't know why, but the CEO's voice, that low, steady tone, echoed in my chest every time I thought of her. Something about the way he looked at me in that elevator. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. As if he, too, knew what it meant to wear dignity like a disguise. That thought scared me more than I expected. I had spent years perfecting how to stay invisible, how to stay useful, how to stay small. And yet, a single sentence from him had made the world shift under my feet. I walked back into the hallway slowly, feeling like I was stepping into a different version of my life. One where the rules I'd followed no longer made sense. One where silence didn't equal safety anymore. I didn't expect to see him again so soon. But there he was, standing by the glass corridor near the boardroom. Phone in hand, unreadable expression painted across his face. He looked different without the noise of the crowd, like a man who had just broken one of his own rules. I hesitated before passing him, unsure if I should nod or disappear into the nearest door. But he looked up first. "Are you okay?" he asked. And the way he said it, it wasn't casual. It wasn't corporate. It was quiet, raw, like he meant every syllable. I nodded too quickly. "Yes, sir." My voice sounded small again. Trained. "Thank you, but it wasn't necessary." "It was," he interrupted, gently but firm. "I let it go too far." There was silence between us, a silence that didn't feel awkward, just full, like something unsaid hovered in the space, waiting to be claimed. I clutched the strap of my bag tighter, my fingers brushing the edge of the photo again. I didn't know why, but I wanted him to see it. Not because I needed validation, but because something told me he might understand. Do you ever carry something just to remind yourself who you used to be? I asked suddenly, my own voice surprising me. He looked startled, but not confused. Slowly, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. "Every day," he replied, offering it without hesitation. For a moment, we weren't CEO and employee. Just two people holding onto faded truths in a world that kept asking us to forget. The newspaper clipping was delicate, folded with care, as if he'd touched it 1,000 times but never dared to open it completely. I took it gently, afraid to damage whatever it carried, and as I unfolded it, my breath caught. It was a grainy photo of a child standing in front of a hospital. The caption read, "Local boy waits all night for mother's release." It was dated over 20 years ago. My eyes shifted from the photo to him, and for the first time I saw not just the CEO, but the boy who had stood in that same silence I'd lived through. "She never made it out," he said quietly, almost like it wasn't meant to be spoken. But someone took the picture and sent it to a sponsor program. That's how I left the city. That's how I got here. He gave a short, breathless laugh. Not from humor, but from the weight of memory. "So no, I don't forget where I came from." I felt something shift inside me. Not pity, not even admiration. Just recognition. The kind that hums under your ribs when someone else has bled in the same way. "I always thought I was alone in that kind of waiting," I whispered. His gaze held mine, steady and unguarded. Maybe we both were. Until now. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider. Not in this hallway. Not in this story. And not with him. The walls around me hadn't moved, but something in me had. Quietly. Irrevocably. I returned to work the next day like I always did, coffee in hand, badge-clipped, face calm. The office still buzzed with its usual rhythm. Printers humming, meetings starting late, someone laughing too loudly near the elevators. No one mentioned the confrontation. Not out loud, anyway. But I noticed the difference in how they looked at me. Not pity. Not curiosity. Something quieter. Almost respect. Still, I didn't let it distract me. I kept my eyes on the screen, fingers typing, reminders blinking on my calendar like nothing had shifted. But I knew. I felt it in the way I walked through the hall without shrinking. I felt it when I passed her desk. Empty now, the ring she always left beside her keyboard gone. I didn't know if they'd argued after I left or if she simply walked away from the wedding on her own. But her chair no longer spun at lunchtime, and that silence said more than words ever could. I sat with it, let it breathe, then opened the folder he had left on my desk that morning. No note, just my name on the cover in his handwriting. Inside was a transfer request for a promotion, his signature at the bottom. I stared at it for a long time, not because of the title or the pay, but because of what it meant. He wasn't trying to fix what happened. He was choosing to believe I already belonged. And suddenly, the weight I'd carried, that quiet, constant doubt, felt a little lighter. Like maybe I didn't have to earn my place. Maybe I had already survived enough. That night, alone in my apartment, I pulled out a box I hadn't touched in years. It was tucked beneath old blankets in the back of the closet. Small, cardboard, unmarked, except for a crease in the corner from a move I never quite unpacked emotionally. Inside were fragments of a different version of me. A pressed flower from my mother's garden, a photo strip from college with my eyes red from crying, and a folded napkin from a cafe I once dreamed of opening, and then the hospital bracelet, the one I'd worn after collapsing from overwork 2 years ago. I held it between my fingers and remembered how embarrassed I'd felt, not from the pain, but from needing help, from not being strong enough to hide it. Back then, I returned to work the same week, smiled through the whispers, convinced myself that strength meant silence. That success meant pretending nothing broke me. But now, looking at that same bracelet, I didn't see weakness. I saw someone who kept going when no one was watching. Someone who never asked for applause but still showed up. The kind of strength that isn't loud but endures. And I realized that's the woman he saw. Not the one in office clothes or quiet corners, but the one who quietly refused to disappear. I tucked the bracelet back in the box, not to forget, but to honor. For the first time, I didn't want to erase where I came from. I wanted to remember, because maybe that's the only way to truly move forward. A few days later, I walked into the same elevator where it all began. This time I stood taller, not because of the promotion or the glances that lingered longer than usual, but because I had finally stopped apologizing for existing. I didn't expect to see him there, but when the doors opened, he was waiting. Alone. No fiancée. No ring. Just him, holding a cup of coffee, my favorite, with the oat milk and the cinnamon dust he once mocked me for. He didn't say anything at first, just extended it toward me like it was the most natural thing in the world. I took it, and for a few seconds, we just stood there. No apology, no explanation. Only understanding. I meant what I said, he said quietly as the elevator began to move. I looked at him, not as the CEO, not as the man who defended me, but as someone who saw me, truly saw me. So did I replied, though I hadn't spoken anything at all. I stepped off on my floor without looking back, but I knew he watched. And that was enough. Because sometimes the real victory doesn't come from grand speeches or signed promotions. Sometimes it's in the quiet way you reclaim your space, in the way you sip your coffee without flinching, in the way you choose not to shrink. I didn't need to be chosen anymore. I had chosen myself. But still, I wondered what the next elevator ride might bring. Would you have pressed the same button I did?